Hello,
Great.
everyone.
Hey, Bud. Hey, Greg. How you guys doing? Morning. Cool. All right. Luca, we have an hour, and these things tend to go by quite quickly. So let's jump right in. We have a few other people trickling in here now, but thank you for taking time to join us. Your books have definitely resonated with me. I think it's a very Lattice-y approach where the topics you talk about are broad ranging across a lot of domains and super thought-provoking. So thank you for just taking time. Would love to start with the cursory kind of quick biography, your background as a management consultant. How did you start writing about everything from management consulting to ergodicity? Would just love a really quick background and we can go from there.
Thank you, Blas. I'm super happy to be here. So my background, I'm an automotive engineer. Then I worked for a few years in management consulting, focusing on manufacturing operations. And I learned a lot there. And after a few years, I moved back to Italy and I started doing in private what I was doing for another company before. So I've been, ever since, it's been 10 years, I'm advising managers, executives, and entrepreneurs on people management. And during my free time between consulting engagements, I tend to write books. And they are very much about things that I lived with my experience observing hundreds of companies.
Fantastic. And we'll start with ergodicity, just because it's something I think very resonant with this group. But why don't you share a little bit about the other topics you've written about, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, so I've written on a lot of things from economics and statistics or ergodicity. Then I've also written about human behavior, and particularly about the difference between decision-making and action-taking. Like a lot of time, we take a decision, that's not the hard part. The hard part is afterwards taking action. Or the same thing, when we try to convince others, we convince them so that they are rationally on board, but then they don't take action afterwards. And that's because we have two completely different mechanisms for making decisions, taking decisions, and then taking action afterwards, and we need to take care of both. So I've written about this. Then I've also published 2 books about people management. I've published another book which is more focused on anti-fragility, and basically it's the idea of how do I apply the idea of anti-fragility from Nassim Taleb to myself as an individual to grow, and a few other things.
Fantastic. Your last point on anti-fragility and sort of action-based, I'm only halfway through, but I'm reading Cesar Hidalgo's Why Information Grows. And he makes this really interesting contrast between knowledge and know-how, where knowledge, you might understand something, but know-how is tacit, right? You can put it into practice, you can swing the golf club, you can write the essay, whatever it is. And that, I think that's a really important thing for me with Lattice, is that it's not just an intellectual journey. It's trying to make these ideas approachable and applicable and sort of part of your day-to-day life, right? It's not just something that is fun to read about. It makes you a better husband, father, partner, investor, whatever. And it's a great, please, yeah.
Just allow me to say one thing about this, because you said this idea from this book, like, of course there is know what and then there is know how. But then I will go even further. There is also trust that, because there are a lot of things that I know I have to do, I know how to do them, and then I still do not do them. Because either I don't have good emotions associated to it, or I do not trust that I need to do them. And this is, for example, something that I touch a lot when I talk about management, is you have 3 levels of management. 1, teaching your people what they have to do, the right things to do. 2, how to do them right. And 3, you need to make them trust that if they do them, good things will happen to them. And until you can't climb all 3 steps of the ladder, nothing will happen.
And would it be fair to say that's the same thing as psychological safety, or is there more to it than just trust that? Go into that a little bit more. I think that's a really interesting way to think of it.
I think it goes beyond that, because psychological safety is the idea that if I do it, nothing bad will happen to me. But action has always a cost in terms of energy and opportunity costs. And I need to trust that if I do it, it's worth it. I make an example, core values.
Yeah.
Core values. Everyone knows that, for example, if you work in manufacturing, you are supposed to wear the safety helmet.
Yeah.
Nothing bad will happen if you wear the safety helmet. So it's not about psychological safety. Why don't people wear the safety helmet? Sometimes because they don't trust that it's worth the discomfort. Sometimes because they need to work so fast and they don't trust that when their manager tells them that they should wear the safety helmet, he really means it even when they are in a rush.
Yeah.
And so you need to make them trust that if you say wear the safety helmet, you mean not only you mean I really mean it, and not only when it's easy, but also when it's hard. And this is a step that a lot of managers fail to do, and that's why then people don't take action.
Love that. Knowledge, know-how, trust that. Okay, cool. So I remember very clearly ergodicity being this kind of light bulb moment for me that kind of got me to like sit up and say, aha. And, I was 25 when I heard about it from the first time from Taleb, and it really was the Ole Peters talk that kind of made it make sense to me. But I wish I'd understood this, as a 15-year-old in high school and not as a 25-year-old. And so we joked last time that we should get a marketer or some sort of meme master to make ergodicity more approachable, right? Because it's this very weird word. It's a relatively hard concept. So tell us about that. You spent a lot of time writing a whole book about it. How do you apply it to your day-to-day life? Would love to just get a little masterclass from you on this term.
Yeah, so first, let me give the example with which I start the book. I think it's super easy to make everything understood. By the way, hi, John, I just seen you're there as well. I make the example of my cousin. My cousin was born in the French Alps in a little town where 3 years old, they put you on the skis. He was very good at skiing. He made it to the World Cup for his age brackets. And then even before he became fully adult, he broke his knee once, broke his leg second time, basically had to abandon the career of skier. And from him, I learned that it's not the fastest skier that wins the championship, but the fastest one among those who finish it, who make it to the finish line. So already this shows that performance is subordinate to survival. And I'm not just saying that survival matters to performance, which we all agree. I'm making the point that it matters more than performance. And I make the example, like let's run some numbers. And I make this example of a ski championship. And my cousin, because he's very, very good, he has a 20% chance of winning each race. And there are 10 races in the championship. However, because my cousin is also reckless, he also has a 20% chance of breaking his leg. So the question is, how many victories is my cousin expected to have to total in a 10 races championship? And the naive answer is 2, because we say there are 10 races, he has a 20% chance of winning each. That makes 10 times 20%, it's 2. However, if you run the numbers, you discover that it's very different. After the first race, he has a 20% chance of having broken his leg, which means he has to skip the other races. This means that his expected wins from the second race is only 80%, the chances that he makes it to the second race, times 20%. And that means that the second race, he only accumulates 0.16 wins, and so on. And if you run the numbers, you discover that the number of wins is only 0.71. So if you do not take into account the irreversible losses, we get a total of 2. If we take into account the irreversible losses, the fact that breaking a leg doesn't only mean that you lose one race, but it means that you lose all following races, we go to a very different result, which is 0.71. So we get this concept of irreversible losses absorb future gains. And that basically is is what's ergodicity. Technically, we say that when irreversible losses don't matter, we are in an ergodic situation. And when irreversible losses matter, we are in a non-ergodic situation. And the thing that matters is not about statistics, but it's strategies that work in one situation don't work in the other situation and the other way around.
Luca, can you, because it's, I think, a little bit harder to maybe visualize what an ergodic state is where irreversible losses don't matter. Can you give us an example of that just to make that a little bit more concrete in our minds?
Well, the thing is that there are no such examples in real life.
Yeah.
But you will see them a lot in models that some statisticians do, some management consultants do. They never exist in real life.
Yeah. What's the benefit of, sorry, what's the benefit of modeling them then? Is it just to give an ideal perfect scenario and then you can sort of reverse engineer it, or why model a state that doesn't exist?
There is no good reason. People do it because it's easier, because they're incompetent.
Okay.
There is no benefit for the users.
Right. Okay, good. I'm glad I wasn't misunderstanding a situation. All right, so all models are non-ergodic, if you will, then in real life. I can imagine that has a lot of impacts on how we understand risk, uncertainty, and maybe other variables, right? How we make decisions. How has understanding this concept changed maybe the way that you approach your life, your decision making? Take it whatever way you will, but some of these concrete outputs would be really fun to understand from you.
Well, I can make two examples. So first example is the idea that in investing, irreversible losses absorb future gains. So it means that the longer my time horizon, the more irreversible losses matter much more than what it looks in the short term. Because if I invest $1,000 and I lose 200, I don't lose 200, I lose 200 plus all future, let's say, dividends, growth, and everything that those 200 would have generated. That's the first thing. Second thing is, for example, one thing is that I published 9 books so far. And all of books, I've done everything, typesetting, edit, everything except the cover. And sometimes people ask me why I'm doing it, because it looks inefficient. My idea is, if I thought that I would only publish 1 or 2 books in my life, it will not make sense to do things in which I learn, because I would have no benefits from learning how to do typesetting first. But if I think that I published so far 9 books, I think that I will publish more in the future, then at this point, the benefits of learning something such as typesetting, they start to grow many more dividends. So this is an idea, I think that the more you expect that you will do an activity in the future, the more it pays to learn about it. Even if you won't do it in the future, for example, because you will have better conversation with whoever will do it for you in the future, or better conversation when you will hire the person who will do it for you in the future. So this idea that the gains of learning, they do not show in the short term, but they show in the long term. So you always need to weigh everything that doesn't show in the short term based on the time horizon. We do it very well with investments usually. We don't do it with things that aren't very quantifiable, but we should do it.
What you said sparks 2 things in me. So I used to work for an interesting guy in aerospace manufacturing, and you probably feel very at home with all the mills and lathes and CNCs we used to have. But he really preached this idea that it was very multidisciplinary and borrowed ideas from biology and physics. And one of our core values was survival is the #1 priority, right? And using that as kind of this driving light where there would be no leverage in the business anywhere. And I just thought it was such an interesting sort of long-term view on a business, right? Okay, if we leverage the business a little, we could grow 2-3% faster every year, but the chances of going to zero are much higher, right? There's always the unexpected black swan that you can't predict. And are you fortified? Are you built to withstand that? And not just withstand it, but take advantage of it, right? And I think it's such a long-term view on things, right? And another example, Luca, just in case it sparks something fun in you, we had a conversation a few weeks ago with an entrepreneur who has a background in music. And he shared a few lessons from Bono from the U2 band. And they, from the age of 17, 18, 19, when they first started really playing together, they kind of were resolute that they'd be doing this for decades. And they chose not to, or they chose to keep the rights to their songs because they knew that in the long term, that would be way better for them, right? So they didn't get the distribution or the help in the early days, but they kept the rights and learned these, integral parts of how do you sell out a stadium, how do you record properly. So I think it's maybe a segue to my next question too, of like, I think I've heard you ask or talk about the importance of time horizons that people take, right? And again, if you're just looking to make it to the next day, you obviously make very different decisions than if you're building this cathedral for the next generation of people to come. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of time horizons, how that plays into ergodicity, how it plays into your life.
Yeah, time horizons are just so important because we usually make an extrapolation fallacy, which is that what works, we play a scenario, for example, 5 years time horizon, we compare two strategies against it, and we think that the strategy that is better over 5 years is also the strategy which is better over 10 years, for example, and that is really not a given. I usually make the numbers with two skiers, just to go back to the example and putting some number. One skier which has a 20% chance of winning each race, but also 20% chance of breaking his leg. 10% chance of breaking his leg. And then another skier which is a 10% chance of winning each race and a 1% chance of breaking his leg because he's more conservative. And what you see is that for time horizons below 6 races in the championship, the risk-taking one wins more. And for time horizons of more than 6 races, the other person, the more risk-conservative wins. So there is not always like the right answer, of course, is not to take any risks, but you need to be conscious of what the risks are, and then check your time horizon, whether what you're doing is one of many bets or your only bet. Like if you lose it, it's very bad for you. And these are all things that you need to take in consideration when you select your strategy. And for me, yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say like something practical that I do myself is I always, whenever I'm thinking about some long-term life decision or project, or I always ask myself, is it something that I would be okay with, whether I die when I'm 90 years old, whether I die when I'm 60 years old, or whether I die next month? And I don't try to optimize for any single time horizon because I don't know how long my life would be. But instead, I just try to make choices that I will be satisfied with, regardless of how long is my time horizon.
Interesting. And so, if we play it out for a little bit, whether it is working an extra hour or going for a walk with your kids or exercising or something, finding that right balance between, I want to be able to be mobile when I'm 90, but I also, my girls are only 3-4 years old one time, and finding what kind of feels right with all those dynamics. Is that kind of the right way to think of it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
With, so one thing I'm curious about, because it's, Ian McGilchrist, I don't know if you come across his work, but super interesting how he kind of frames things like left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and how the West has become just very reliant on numbers and kind of certainty, if you will, and a little less comfortable with letting go and intuition. But your point about the quantifiable examples being much easier to latch onto, right? Because it's something that's feels a little bit more concrete, right? Buffett doesn't have the highest returns, but he's been doing it for 70 years. So, he gets the compounding effect. If we go to like squishier parts of our lives, right? Again, whether it is a little bit more exercise or relationships driven, how do you apply some of these ideas, right? And sorry, I keep honing on kind of like concrete ideas, but I think that's the hope with these sorts of discussions, is we can make somewhat abstract ideas a little bit more approachable. So whether it's an example you came across from your book or just how you implement some of these ideas in your own life, would love to turn to the squishy for a minute.
Yeah, so I try to avoid irreversible losses, which means, for example, when I lift weights, I try to, or work out, I try to work out as hard as I can without the risk of injury. Then, of course, like, again, of course, it's a spectrum. Like, there is not like a precise weight, but that's kind of the concept and the way in which I approach. I try to work as hard as possible without suffering a burnout. And so on. Like, it's always like try to push it, but not push it to the point in which you're likely to get these irreversible consequences.
I love that. It's in front of me. It's something I look at every time I come into my office, but it just says 85%. And my nature is I tend to overput things. I work a little too hard and do a little bit too much. And it was this idea from a sprinter or a sprinting coach that the fastest you run is when you're doing kind of 85% effort, right? Because if you try too hard, your technique breaks down, you're pushing yourself a little bit too much, et cetera, et cetera. And really finding that sweet spot where, you're not being lazy, but you're also not losing your technique. And it reminded me of what you just said, right? Because you can work out really hard one day and then you're sore for a week and you don't get to do any other workouts. Or you kind of take the forever approach and I'm not going to get strong tomorrow or next week, but over the span of my lifetime, I will get there. Okay, that's super helpful. Before we maybe switch gears a little bit, anything else on ergodicity, anti-fragility that I should have asked or that you want to make sure that we cover?
Just because you mentioned anti-fragility, like, just wanted to cover that a little bit. So first, what's anti-fragility? Anti-fragility is the idea that you benefit from problems. And a lot of people, they think instead that it's just that you resist problems. That's not it. Resisting problems is just being robust. Instead, here we're talking about things which benefit from problems. And so a big question is how do you get more anti-fragile? And it's not just, for example, about diversifying or having some buffer, some cash reserves, or these kind of things, because those are things that make you robust, but they don't make you anti-fragile. They don't make you better off if you have some problem. So the question is, what can make you better off if there is a problem? And that could be, for example, some habits of learning, some habits of noticing fast when you're doing something wrong, and so on. And I apply this a lot. For example, for the past few years, I've been teaching a course on how to make an organization anti-fragile. And a big part of it is how do you ensure that when there is a problem, people learn from it? And just to give you an example, that the number one question is, when there is a problem, do people raise a hand? And number two, when people raise a hand, the events that follow, do they make them more likely to raise a hand the second time in the future, or do they make them less likely to raise a hand in the future? Because in a lot of organizations, what happens is that you raise the hand once, and then the problem you identified becomes your problem. Your boss assigns it to you. You need to work overtime, or you get criticized for it. Anyway, you learn the lesson that you don't have to raise the hand a second time in the future. And for example, that's wrong. So it's this idea of identifying the things that make you benefit from problem, and then making sure that you do more of them in the future rather than fewer.
On that note, Luca, Toby from Shopify is a leader I like a lot. I've never met him, but just through podcasts and what he's written, he seems to approach things in a really interesting way. And he makes it a point that he's always the last person to speak in any sort of meeting, right? So they might pose a question or, we're here to tackle this problem. But, he makes sure that other people voice their opinion first. So it's not just, the CEO says this and nobody else really feels the need to speak up after that. But I'd be curious, in your experience, you've worked with, I don't know how many companies over the years, but that intuitively is such an obvious thing, right? Like, yes, we don't want to make the same mistake again. We want our people to feel comfortable. So I don't think there's any like intellectual or theoretical argument against it, but obviously not everyone does that, right? Or it'd be kind of a solved problem. What have you seen that makes people nervous to speak up the next time or doesn't allow organizations to learn? Would love to get your insights on that.
Well, so I would say two big, let's say, sins that prevent learning. So one is what happens again when someone raises a hand and then you get extra work because of it, or you get reprimanded, whatever, and they teach. So that's one thing. The other thing is you raise a hand, the problem gets listened, but then either it results in a waste of time, or things don't really change, or we solve the problem this time, but then it happens again. And over time, people lose the trust that raising the hand matters.
Mm.
And so instead, the companies which are good at this, instead what they do is that they really follow through each problem. I used to work, for example, in DuPont, and one thing that they were doing quite well is that when there is a major incident, there is an incident investigation, and the local site manager, or anyway the highest person in the hierarchy in that location, is copied in. They start the investigation. I mean, not necessarily that they go on the floor like looking what happened, but they start the first. They say like, now we do the investigation. Here's what happens. Here's what we're going to do, and then they close it. And they make sure that whatever is the learning, it will get implemented. And because incident investigations are shown to have an effect, there is a track record. People trust that raise the hand matters. So we go again into the ladder I was telling you before. Know what, know how, trust. Trust is a track record. Good organizations produce a track record that desired behaviors lead to good outcomes.
Fascinating. Okay. John, I know you had a quick topic. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Hey, Luca, good to see you. So one of the most impactful parts of your book for me was, for example, the story you told about ambulance response times in, I think it's Turin during COVID. And that kind of, I'd love for you to get into that. And then more broadly, the thing that sort of hit me, between the eyes was, I think our societies in general, certainly all of the statistics training I've had, and I've had a lot, has sort of suggested to me that I ought to architect my life based on average or expected outcomes, whether that's business, whether that's a portfolio of investments, whether that's how I raise a family. Just about everything is sort of look at the data, assume that you'll get something approximating the average outcome with some standard deviation around it, and then go. And the story you told about ambulance response times really sort of scared me, because it made me realize that, and I'll let you tell the story, but it made me realize that I think there are a lot of ways we construct our societies where we assume an average that we're never going to get. And you covered that a little bit in investing, but could you say a little more, maybe tell that story? Could you say a little more on how maybe we ought to rethink how we're constructing societies, because we're probably not any of us going to get the average or expected outcome?
Yeah, thank you, John. I will give you the 2023 updated version of the story. In 2020, so the first year of COVID, actually there have been fewer people in the hospitals in Italy than during the average year. And ambulance response time, they weren't they weren't so bad. Yet in Bergamo, during March, April, it's been a catastrophe. People tried to get into the hospitals, it was full, ambulances weren't coming, and so on. And the thing you learn is that it doesn't matter what's the average occupation of a hospital, it doesn't matter what's the average response time of the ambulance. You care about how much it will take for the ambulance to come the time that you're sick. And you care how much space there will be in the hospital the day that you're sick. So you don't just care about the average, you care about the full distribution. So you not just like assuming it's a bell curve, because sometimes it's not. You care about the tails. You don't care what's the average occupancy in the hospital. That doesn't matter. What you care is how many days have people been unable to enter the hospital. That's for example the question. Now I'm not a doctor, but so now I will just say some random numbers. But for example, I don't care if the medium time for an ambulance to reach the hospital is 20 minutes. Let's say that the time that you have if you have a heart attack is 30 minutes. Now I'm saying random numbers. What I care is the percentage of times that the ambulance makes it to the hospital by 30 minutes. And I think that that's what we should optimize a bit more. So for example, I give another example. I had a discussion recently with someone who had a lot of his network in the startup that he was working for, stock options and stuff. And we were talking about diversification, and my idea is you should diversify. And his point was, anything that I diversify with will have lower average returns than my startup, because my startup is a great startup. And he had some reasons, like there were very good reasons to expect that the startup would be wildly successful. But the question is, do you care about the average wealth that you will have in 10 years? Or do you care about the distribution? For example, if there is 1 chance in 10 that you are super rich, 4 chances in 10 that you are very rich, and 5 chances in 10 that the startups never IPOs and your options are worthless, what's best for you? Do you prefer that, or do you maybe want something which you are less rich in the good scenarios, but you are still rich in the bad scenarios because you took half of your options, for example, and diversified it in the stock market? And I think that that's the idea. You look about the distribution of outcomes, not the average.
Yeah, a mental model I've kind of adopted to try to hammer this point home for myself is I've tried to think about what are items or events or scenarios where in a given moment I would be willing to pay an enormous amount of my net worth for it. So, for example, I used to live in a city that had some fairly serious rioting, and I lived right in the middle of it. And I've never owned guns, but I actually bought a gun, and I really didn't want to use it. And I think me 10 years ago would have said, the odds of the riot moving into my apartment building are incredibly low, and I think they were. But what I realized was I'm, not the most skilled hand-to-hand combat person. And so, there was a scenario with a non-zero probability that I would pay an enormous amount of my net worth just to have a gun so I could defend my family. And so, I still never used the thing, but that was one where I realized, oh, actually, here's something that could take us out. And so it's actually logical to spend a little bit of money and get a little bit of training to, dramatically reduce that scenario. And I'd sort of feel like the world is full of that. For example, at least here in the States, maybe a lot of other places, when I was growing up, there were not defibrillators all over the place. And now if you go into any building of any scale, there's defibrillators on the wall. And that, it's just another case of, small tail risk, but enormous, consequence. And I think the more we think about this individually and at a societal level, I think there are all these things where there's sort of, I think of them as cheap forms of insurance, right? If you can spend a few hundred or a few $1,000s and then, eliminate or dramatically reduce a low probability event, but one with high consequence, you should do that. And I think sort of as a society, we're still learning what that is. Obviously, how we eat is a big thing. Public health in general is a big thing. How we invest is a big thing. I love Munger's idea of the point of investing is finding places where it's safe not to diversify. I think there's a lot for that, but it feels like it's a society we're in the early stages of figuring out how to work this in.
Thank you, John. I really like the question that you had, for example, like asking yourself what are things that I will spend a lot of money on in case of need. That's a great question to think like where you need more insurance or proactive action on. Another question which I often ask some of my clients, for example, is imagine that one of your subordinates calls you in the middle of the night, but it's a missed call, so you cannot see why they called you. What's the first thing that comes into mind that might have caused that call? Or you can imagine it with your wife or anything. And I just love these questions because they help you think about things that you would not think normally, but they are risks. And then I wanted to add another thing, like the example you made about the letters on the wall, like insurance for tail risk. The big question over the long term that you want to have is, once you have those insurance in place, how do you prevent dismantling them? Because there is always the risk that someone comes and says, oh, this leather of the wall, we never use them in 20 years. We could put something else. And this is a very big question that a lot of companies should think about, like how do we, and societies, how do we prevent the dismantling of the precautions that we already have?
Mm-hmm. And look, it brought together a few different topics for me too, right? Where, again, going back to business and manufacturing environments, maybe especially, being positioned to not only handle the average, but also peak loads is really expensive, right? Because it's like, you're not producing at Christmas level peaks all year round, but if you can't support that, you're also missing out on revenue. So I think it maybe ties together that like, long-term time horizon and being able to handle, or at least try to position yourself to not have any zeros, right? And sort of anything times 0 is 0. Like I come back to that a lot, right? And you don't want that situation. To maybe build off John's point a little bit, getting back to Taleb for a second, or at least a proposition he made popular with the black swan. What other maybe low probability, high severity events have you seen in business or personal life that you've tried to structure around, right? So we talked about diversifying. Obviously, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. And it also brought to mind a little bit this podcast that Naval did that I've listened to quite a lot, how to get rich or something like that. But his point is like, you want to develop the skill so that if you were to live your life 1,000 times, you'd be able to build wealth in almost every one of them. And you don't rely on the jackpot scenario, right? So that was maybe a lot of questions in one. I can break it down if helpful, but maybe just talking about sort of like how you might think about black swans and what you've done in your life to try to avoid them, if possible, yeah. Right? That might be a paradox.
No, that's a good question. So there are two considerations to this. One is the usual, like black swans, you cannot really predict them. So you need, in general, to have a bit of redundancy, like to be a bit healthier than you need, have a bit more cash than you need, and these kind of things. Much more interesting is the idea of gray swans. So gray swans are things that some people will say are black swans, but in reality, they were very predictable. For example, the pandemic wasn't a black swan, it was a gray swan. Why? Because we had pandemics in the past, because we had people experimenting with viruses all over the world. And regardless of whether this pandemic comes from that, the chances that we would have had a pandemic were very, very high. So a big question, for example, now, both for companies and for private life is, what are the gray swans in your life? So events that happen relatively frequently, let's say in the order of 1 in 1,000 to 10%, you want to look for this bracket, and yet people treat as if they never happened to them. I make an example. Key employees quitting. Some companies do this well. They consider the probability that their employees will quit for any reason. Some other companies instead, they leave as if their employees will never quit. Big problem. And well, there a lot have been written on this, but the way I approach it for myself is I ask, don't ask yourself whether your key employee will leave. Imagine that today he leaves. And then you ask yourself, what would have caused him to leave? And that is the cause that you want to prevent. Same thing. I don't imagine whether I will go to the hospital. I ask myself, imagine that tomorrow an ambulance brings me to the hospital. What would be the most likely reason? And then I try to prevent that and so on.
Two things there, Luca, where this idea of redundancy just comes back everywhere, right? We have 2 kidneys, 2 eyes, all this for a very, very important reason. And it's physically, biologically expensive. Same thing, right? With maybe training up somebody else behind your key employee, right? Maybe they don't really produce anything for a while, but that key employee leaves, you have a backup, you have some redundancy. I forget the second point I was going to make. I'll come back to it in a second, or hopefully it'll come back to me in a second. As we start getting towards the end of this conversation, maybe, what's top of mind today, right? You've written about a lot of really interesting different topics from all sort of domains. What piques your interest today? If you have a new book on the horizon, would love to hear what that might be about.
Yeah, so one thing I've recently published is an online course on managing remote teams. And the problem that I'm tackling mostly is the one of training and coaching as a manager. Because big problem is that so many managers, they don't train, coach, give feedback to their employees. Or better say, they do it on the output, but they don't do it on a lot of other things such as internal collaboration, participating to meetings, and so on. I give an example. In a lot of companies, meetings are boring or ineffective. Many times the reason is that no one explained to anyone how to be effective participants in a meeting. When I was working for my previous company, every week we would have a meeting in which we would say progress updates. How many times have I been trained on giving an effective progress update? 0.
Yeah.
I used to send 20, 30 emails, 100 of emails a day. How many times have I been trained on sending emails? 0. And yet, for example, I make an example like, imagine that I always write emails too politely, and that causes me to add 20 seconds per email of writing, and I send 20 emails per day. That's 3 work days over a year. Why does 3 days over a work here, those 3 work days a year go into waste? Because my manager has never told me that I could write the emails shorter, for example, or these kind of things. So I really think that a very low-hanging fruit for a lot of organizations and teams is just managers giving a bit of coaching and training to their people. But formal training doesn't work. Because a lot of times I have this discussion, and then managers come back and then call HRs and say, oh, you need to call someone to make an email training for our people, for example. That doesn't work. Why? Because if you go online right now and you Google for online email training, I'm sure that there will be great email trainings, but what they will teach you will not be relevant to the emails you're writing. I don't care about writing an effective email. I care, how can I convince my boss, for example, like how should I write an email to legal? How should I do these kind of things? So these are not trainings that you can just get out of the shelf. This is feedback that the manager needs to give, because the manager is the only one who knows the context and can give the feedback. And then second thing, it cannot be a session. Because if you do, for example, if you decide like, okay, I understood, Luca, I, the manager, need to train my people on sending better emails. So now I schedule Thursday, half an hour training on sending emails. what happens a lot of times is that that doesn't work because it's one-way teaching. A lot of time people get, maybe they learn one thing or two, but then they go back to their work and they just keep writing as before. Maybe the 9 out of 10 things that we're saying were wasted. Some people get overwhelmed. Some people, they take it personally. Some people, they think it doesn't apply to them. So don't do that. Instead, your job is just to give some pieces of feedback every now and then. You receive an email which is excessively long. You just tell him, by the way, that email could have been a 2-liners. You receive an email, a progress update that hides the one problem behind the 10 paragraphs of good things which are going as expected. You tell your people that they should have led with the problem. And then, of course, there is some balance. Like, if you never done that, and then tomorrow you start telling 10 wrong things to people, catastrophe. Instead, you just proceed very, very slowly. You think maybe one thing I noticed during this week, I will tell it to my people, and then you start building up on that. And then you should also observe a ratio of ideally 2 positive per 1 negative. So reinforcing good behavior. But you again, it cannot be a fixed structure, because when I say people try to take 2 positive for 1 negative, what happens is that they see 1 negative and then they think, what 2 positives can I come up with? That's insincere and that's low quality feedback. Instead, it just means you try to give feedback as normal. At the end of the day, you ask yourself, did I give more positive than negative feedback? If the answer is not, it means you need to keep more of an eye on the good that your people are doing, not taking it for granted, reinforcing the behavior so that they will do it even when they're rushed, or even the day that they come to the office with a headache and so on or whatnot, or even just they feel like, oh, finally my boss is noticing me. Oh, finally taking the risk of writing the problem on top of the email, my boss is telling me that it's worth it, for example. So it's avoid any kind of fixed structure, just try to be a little bit more helpful on your people, giving some feedback every now and then.
Love that, Luca. It's a famous example, at least in the US with basketball, but this famous coach, John Wooden, blah, 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 he's written a lot of great books, and it's now lore, I would say, but he recruited the best players in the country, and famously on their first day, he would teach them how to put their socks on. And the point is, if you don't put your socks on, you develop blisters. And if you develop blisters, you can't play well. And if you can't play well, we'll lose. And I just think it's this, small attention to details, but also how do you be an effective meeting participant? How do you put your socks on? That parallel feels very clean to me, right? And it goes for granted. And the email, same thing, right? How do you imagine how much time that could save, or miscommunication that could avoid just with a little class? And the other thing I've done for the last couple of years is this idea of like how to work well with BLOS. And it's just like, I outline my flaws as like, look, I'm very impatient. I don't like this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I do love to see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the amount, and starting my own little company now, kind of like this thought of, what if we had everyone who joined have some sort of version of that, right? Where, I'm an engineer and I tend to really like to work between like midnight and 2 a.m. and that's like my peak time. And but I like to wake up late and whatever. We can have all these steps of like how to work well with this person. And anyway, it sparked that idea in me, and like these little details really add up. And how do you write good emails? How do you be an effective meeting participant? What is a good agenda? All these little things that just make a huge difference in the end. So thank you for that. Really cool.
Well, thank you, Blas. And I love what you said about that. I particularly love the sports example. If I can add 2 more sports examples,
please,
that are really on point. One is, I remember there was this game in basketball. San Antonio Spurs were playing. There was this player takes a wild 3-point shot in a very awkward position with the defender to his face, makes the 3-point shot. His coach reaction, Greg Popovich's reaction, he benched the player.
Yeah.
And the reason he benched it was because, now I'm paraphrasing, but we are in the business of taking good shots.
Yeah.
That's what we win at games. You took a bad shot, I don't care about the result.
Love that. Yeah, love that.
And then
Yeah.
the second example is, imagine if a basketball coach managed their players like a manager. He doesn't train them, he doesn't watch them play, he only meets them in his office, and he only evaluates them based on numbers on the report card. That would be tragedy. He would be a terrible coach. And yet, that's how most managers manage. And instead, managers should do a bit more of what sports coaches do. Watch their people play, train them, instead of meeting them in the office, meeting them on where they work.
Yeah.
Not as a statement, but because you get to see the real context. You get to see how people play with each other. You need to watch how people play with each other to give them the right feedback so that they get better. So it means participating to meeting, giving feedback after the meeting. If you manage salespeople, every now and then going on sales call with them and giving them feedback on that and so on.
It resonates deeply. I played tennis growing up and was always coached, right? And I love that. And I miss that, honestly, in the professional world for a long time. You're always nervous that you're going to offend someone, but that's part of getting better, right? If it wasn't somewhat painful, you wouldn't be growing. Nuno, I know you had a question for Luca, if you want to jump in with your question here.
Hey, everyone. Hi, Luca. Thanks, Bless. Really appreciate the conversation. As you mentioned, you wrote 9 books, and they're all very interesting, like Control Heuristic and Ergodicity. But one of my favorites is actually 100 Truths That You Will Learn Too Late. And to me, it's a little bit like the Clayton Christensen books. Everyone talks about disruption theory and innovation, but actually my favorite is How Will You Measure Your Life? So I see the parallel there. But my question was, what was the process for you to write this book? Was it something that you were gathering over your life, some kind of operating principles, or, what was the process for which you gathered all of these 100 truths? And can you speak a little bit more about the book for other people that might not be familiar?
Yeah, thank you, Nuno. So what happened is, so it's a book about personal development, and I'm recounting 100 rules of basically how the world works that I wish I had known much earlier. And in the title I write it's 100 truths. Actually, then I explain it's 100 rules, because the principle is these are the rules. You can ignore them if you want, or you can play different games. But if you play that game, there is this rule. And if you play that game and don't play by that rule, you will be frustrated with what happens, which is what happened to me for years for some things. And to go to your question of how I gather these, so these are basically things that I learned in my life. And what happened is that a few years ago, I had this couple of weeks of break in which I didn't do any consulting work. I followed we were traveling with my wife across Asia. And in those 2 weeks, I was just like, let's plan this book and let's write down, let's come up with 100, and I just tried to think about past experiences in which I had frustrations. And then I asked myself, what did the frustration come from? Which was the rule that I didn't follow? And that's how I came with the list. Yeah.
Any follow-on questions there, Nuno?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I was actually wondering if you had followed something like gathering all of these principles over your life, or if you had sat down and went, what happened during my life to trigger this. And I find it interesting that it was asking about frustration and what were the things that happened to you, what rules did you not follow to get there? And I just found it very interesting that you got there by asking that question. So thank you for the insight.
Oh, thank you, Nuno. Yeah, it's mostly things that happened to me. I say mostly because I won't lie. There are probably 5 to 10 rules which didn't apply to me, like I've seen it in others. But yeah, in general, it's asking what caused frustration in me or in others, and I think that's a great question to ask also, for example, in your life, in companies. One of my beliefs, for example, is that in companies we have quality incidents, we have safety incidents, we have ethical incidents, we should have frustration incidents, which are like safety incident. What happens is that afterwards, you make an incident investigation. You try to learn something about it, and you try to implement some learning so that it doesn't happen for the same time, for the same reason again in the future. Same thing with frustration. Every time that you see someone frustrated in your company, you should ask yourself, what's the reason? And is there something we can prevent so that that frustration doesn't happen anymore? Because frustration is a bit like cockroaches. Cockroaches, you see one in your house, you have 100. Same thing in your company. You see one episode of frustration, there are 100 similar episodes of frustration. It's just that people are much better at keeping a straight face. But you cannot, just like cockroaches, you cannot act, oh, there is one cockroach and say, oh, it was just one. Because there are others. Same thing in a company. You see one episode of frustration, you should act as if there were 100 similar. That's the standard over which you should decide whether to take action or not.
Yeah, absolutely. As efficient as the company I'm at right now, I can see a lot of issues with frustrations that don't go addressed exactly because of this, because they seem like a one-off. And so I just had one last follow-up question, which is, if it's not too personal, could you give one example of at least one of these 100 truths that you might think could apply?
Well, one very personal example is, okay, most of the rules that I teach are about, let's say, business, career, personal growth, and so on. But one that there are just a few which are not on this team, but one that was very personal for me was the idea that you need the I don't remember how I formulate in the book, but the idea that you need to grow muscles. And the reason I'm saying this is because I was born with, I have a few vertebrae which are molded together. So there is no mobility. I have these two vertebrae which are just a single bone. And because of that, if you look me from the profile, I'm a bit hunched. And because of that, doctor said, for all my life, you said you shouldn't lift heavy weights, and you should try to avoid the gym, otherwise you will have back pain. And then what I discovered is that I still had back pain anyway, when I was 16, 18 years old, and so on. And then what got me out of the back pain was at some point at 24 years old, I finally said, whatever the doctor said, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to try to build some of the muscles. And that passed. And the way that, and then I formulated this a bit more precisely in another rule, which is the idea that your problems are likely not to be special. And I don't say it in an absolute way, but I'm saying it as, do not think that your problems are special until you tried what worked for everyone else. So because there are some times in which your problem is really unique. But a lot of times, because we think it's unique, we don't try what worked for others. And very often we have the same problem that everyone else had. So my rule is, you think you have a unique problem, try for 3 months what works for others, and then maybe you can say that your problem is unique. Yeah.
Luca, I want to be mindful of your time. We're just at the top of the hour here. Yeah.
I've seen that Vlad had a question, I think.
Yeah. If you have time, yeah, please. Yeah. Okay, great.
Look, I think maybe for everyone's benefit here, maybe talk a little bit more about your coaching side of I guess, of your practice and the format. How do you approach this? Is it one-on-ones? Is it group sessions? Especially kind of at the executive level. I'd be curious to learn a little bit more. Maybe others will benefit.
You mean for my for how I work with companies? Yeah.
Well, I guess, you'd also coach one-on-one as
Yes,
far as
yes.
yes, maybe talk a little
Yes.
bit that side a little bit.
Yeah, so my big belief is that for what regards improvements in people management and people operations, the key tool is coaching. I don't mean coaching as in I don't mean coaching as natural as intended as someone comes and they don't know anything about what you do and they just ask questions a bit in a Socratic way. I don't mean that. I just mean the idea of you give small tasks to your people, you check how they do them, and you give them feedback. And you don't do it proactively, because a lot of times you would do it just for the sake of doing this, and you would do things which are not relevant, but you do it reactively. Like you see that someone is not good at doing something, then you work with him one-on-one, you give him a small task, you give him a one improvement on which to focus on, you set him up to success. So you check whether they have what it takes to do it. If not, you teach them a bit. You check whether they're taking action. If they're not taking action, you give them something which is too big, something smaller. Then you give them immediate feedback, something like that. So this is what I think is the number one tool. Now, how do I put this tool in a broader context? So sometimes it happens that I'm contacted by individual managers who just ask me to work with me as an executive coach. And usually we have a series of calls, one every week, one every 2 weeks for 3 months. And we just, we just go through the usual problems that people in this role have. I know from my experience what are the possible problems. I validate whether they apply. And then in each call, we try to solve one. And we do it with role play. And the reason we do it with role play is because I cannot come to your company. Like, I mean, technically I can, and very few times I do it in person, but most of the time it's over Zoom. So let's say that let's say that I believe, for example, that you are not very clear or actionable when you give feedback. Then I will do something in front of you. I ask you to give feedback to me. And then I tell you what I think about it. And then at the end of the call, we set an objective such as try to do it with your people, and then next call you tell me. But the key point is you do it with me, and I give you feedback specifically on that, because I need to see you. And then not only that, but once you do it, I need to validate that the new way you're doing it was better than the way before, because otherwise you will not do it. So this is how I work with individuals. Other times I work with teams, and what happens is that either I have this series of calls with the manager, and then I get him to do it with his people. Or what happens is that maybe I have some calls with his people, sometimes with them attending, sometimes not, and I try to coach the people directly. With organization, sometimes I either do projects alone. And what I do in this case is I work with senior management, with the top executives, and I coach them on coaching others. And then it trickles down. And sometimes I just let them to trickle down, or sometimes then we have a call once every 2 weeks, once every month, in which we check how the trickle down is going, are they sustaining it, and these kind of things. And sometimes instead I have a company that asks me to do a larger project that I cannot do alone. And then I have 2 consulting companies that I work with, and then I get their help to do something with a larger scale, or maybe like a presence all over the place.
I appreciate it, Luca. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad. Luca, to wrap up, and we'll include it in show notes and stuff like that. But if people wanted to learn more about you, you have your website, you're easy to Google, easy to find. But is there anything else you'd ask of the community? You know, it's a lot of investors, a lot of really thoughtful people, run organizations, large and small. Anything at all that we could do to try to be helpful to you, whether it's in a book or in your coaching practice or anything else?
Well, 2 things. One is, if you read any of my books, please let me know any feedback, especially improvements. And I'm not really interested in feedback like great book and so on. But if you can tell me what's boring, what's missing and what's unclear. These are the three pieces of feedback which are very, very, very valuable for me. And for my consulting, so one thing is like, if you want to work with me, of course, we can do that. And the other thing is, if you know someone instead, which would be of benefit for them to work with me and for me to work with them, if you can just set us in contact, that would be very useful.
Fantastic. Luca, thank you so much for your time. This was really fun, and I appreciate you going a few minutes over. This was super helpful. So thank you again.
No, thank you so much, Blas, for inviting, and thank you everyone for the questions. And thank you. I had a blast. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Luca.
Thank you, everyone.
Blas. Good to see everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.